Tell me if you heard about this. On May 5th, 4 days ago, the United States officially concluded Operation Epic Fury, the military campaign against Iran that began on February 28th. The war is over, officially over. And I am asking you directly, did you see that announced anywhere? Did CNN run a primetime special declaring that the war ended? Did the White House hold a Rose Garden press conference with Trump claiming victory? Did any mainstream media outlet tell you that the military operation that killed over 3,400 Iranians and displaced millions across the region just quietly stopped? You did not hear about it because they did not tell you. And the reason they did not tell you is because what actually ended on May 5th was not the war. What ended was the official military operation that had a code name and a command structure and a budget line in the Pentagon. What did not end was the fighting. Israel killed 24 people in Lebanon yesterday. The Strait of Hormuz is still functionally closed. American forces are still deployed across the Gulf. Iranian proxies are still launching attacks, and the diplomatic negotiations that are supposed to produce a permanent settlement are still grinding forward with no resolution in sight. So let me be very clear about what I am telling you. The United States government ended a war without announcing it, without explaining what was achieved, and without addressing the fact that all the conditions that produced the war in the first place are still active. That is not how wars are supposed to end. That is how wars get papered over when the people running them realize they cannot win, but also cannot admit they lost. Having spent decades in military intelligence, I can tell you that when a government goes silent about the conclusion of a military operation, it is because the conclusion does not match the objectives that were used to justify starting the operation. And what I am going to walk you through in this analysis is exactly what Operation Epic Fury was supposed to achieve, what it actually achieved, and why the gap between those two things is so large that nobody in Washington wants to talk about it. Now, let me give you the full picture of what Operation Epic Fury actually was, because understanding the scope and scale of this operation is essential to understanding why its conclusion is being treated like something to bury rather than celebrate. Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th, 2026, with coordinated strikes by U.S. and Israeli forces against Iranian nuclear facilities, ballistic missile production infrastructure, and military command centers. The stated objectives, according to official U.S. and Israeli government statements, were to induce regime change in Iran, permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons capability, and destroy the ballistic missile program that threatens Israel and U.S. forces in the region. The opening phase of the operation was devastating. The first wave of strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That alone was supposed to be the catalyst for regime collapse. The theory, the strategic logic that U.S. planners were operating under was that Khamenei's death would create a power vacuum that reformist elements inside Iran could exploit, leading to the overthrow of the Islamic Republic and its replacement with a government willing to negotiate on U.S. terms. That did not happen. Instead, Khamenei's son was selected as his successor within days. The regime did not collapse. It consolidated. And rather than triggering internal revolution, the strikes triggered external retaliation on a scale that U.S. and Israeli planners clearly did not anticipate. Iran launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones targeting U.S. military installations, Israeli cities, and infrastructure across the Gulf states. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. Global oil prices spiked. Supply chains were disrupted. And suddenly, the limited military operation that was supposed to take 2 weeks and produce regime change turned into a 2-month campaign that killed thousands of people, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and achieved none of its stated objectives. By early April, the operational tempo was unsustainable. The United States was running low on precision munitions. Israel was facing manpower shortages and political pressure from a population exhausted by months of sustained missile attacks. Iran had taken catastrophic damage, but remained functional as a military and political entity. And every day the fighting continued was a day that made it harder for any side to claim victory. So on April 8th, a ceasefire was announced. Mediated by Pakistan, the framework involved a pause in direct U.S. and Iranian military operations. That ceasefire has been violated repeatedly by both sides, but it has technically held in the sense that the U.S. and Iran have not conducted large-scale strikes against each other's territory since early April. And then on May 5th, without announcement, without fanfare, without any official statement explaining what had been accomplished, the Pentagon quietly updated its operational status documents to reflect that Operation Epic Fury had concluded. That is how you found out the war ended, if you were paying close enough attention to Pentagon filings to notice, which almost nobody was. Let me break down what was actually achieved versus what was supposed to be achieved, because this gap is the entire story of why the operation's conclusion is being handled with complete silence. The stated objective was regime change. The official position from both the United States and Israel in the lead up to the strikes was that the Islamic Republic of Iran represented an existential threat that could only be addressed through fundamental political transformation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in a February 26th briefing that the operation would create conditions for the Iranian people to choose a different path. Israeli officials described it as an opportunity to end 45 years of theocratic rule. The result is that the regime is still in power, now led by Khamenei's son, with the internal opposition more suppressed than it was before the strikes began. Protests that erupted in early 2026, demanding economic reform and government accountability, were crushed with extreme force during and after Operation Epic Fury. Thousands of arrests, documented cases of torture. The regime used the external attack as justification for crackdowns that would have been harder to execute without the wartime context. That is not regime change. That is regime consolidation through the rally around the flag effect that external attacks always produce. The stated objective was to permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear capability. The word permanently was used repeatedly in official statements. This was not supposed to be a temporary setback to Iran's program. This was supposed to be the end of Iran's ability to ever produce a nuclear weapon. The result is that Iran's nuclear facilities took significant damage. Yes, the Natanz enrichment facility was struck. Fordow took damage. Key research facilities were destroyed. But the International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed in assessments released in late April that Iran retains the technical knowledge, the scientific personnel, and enough centrifuge capacity distributed across sites that were not hit to rebuild its enrichment program within 18 to 24 months if it chooses to do so. The infrastructure was damaged. The capability was not eliminated. And more importantly, the political will to pursue nuclear capability, if anything, has been strengthened by the demonstration that conventional military inferiority leaves Iran vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack. The stated objective was to destroy Iran's ballistic missile program. The word destroy, not degrade, not disrupt, destroy. Make it so that Iran can no longer threaten Israel or U.S. forces with long-range precision strike. The result is that Iran fired over 600 ballistic missiles during the conflict, demonstrating that its launch capacity, its targeting systems, its command and control architecture, and its production infrastructure were resilient enough to sustain operations throughout a 2-month campaign against the most sophisticated military forces on the planet. Production facilities were hit, some launchers were destroyed, but the program itself, the distributed network of mobile launchers, hardened storage sites, and underground production facilities survived. Iran demonstrated during the conflict that it can still impose costs on Israeli and American targets through ballistic missile strikes, even after absorbing everything the U.S. and Israel could throw at it. That is not a destroyed program. That is a tested and validated program. So what was achieved? Iran took massive damage. Over 3,400 Iranians were killed, according to Iran's Ministry of Health. Critical infrastructure was destroyed. The economy was devastated by the combination of military strikes and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which prevented oil exports. Iran's regional position was weakened as some of its proxy forces took losses and some of its Gulf state relationships deteriorated. But none of that translates into the objectives that were used to justify Operation Epic Fury. Damage is not the same as victory. Degradation is not the same as elimination. And causing pain to an adversary is not the same as changing their behavior or removing them from power. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Because what I am about to explain, why this matters beyond just the question of whether one military operation succeeded or failed, is something you will not hear addressed honestly anywhere else in media. This is about what happens when governments launch wars they cannot win and then try to memory hole the whole thing when the results do not match the promises. Now, let me tell you why the way this war ended, or did not end, depending on how you define it, creates massive problems going forward. The ceasefire that has been in place since April 8th is not a peace agreement. It is a pause. And the difference between those two things matters enormously. A peace agreement addresses the underlying issues that caused the conflict. It creates mechanisms for resolving disputes. It establishes conditions that both sides accept as the basis for ending hostilities permanently. The current ceasefire does none of that. It pauses direct U.S.-Iranian military action. It does not address Iran's nuclear program. It does not address the ballistic missile threat. It does not address Iranian support for proxy forces. It does not address the closure of the Strait of Hormuz or the conditions under which it would reopen. It does not address sanctions. It does not address the fundamental strategic competition between the United States and Iran for influence in the Middle East. All of those issues, every single one of them is still unresolved, which means that the conditions that produced Operation Epic Fury in the first place are still active. And as long as those conditions are active, the risk of the war restarting is not hypothetical. It is structural. Pakistan has been mediating negotiations between the U.S. and Iran aimed at constructing a more comprehensive framework. Those negotiations are ongoing, but they are grinding forward with no breakthrough in sight because The gaps between what the U.S. wants and what Iran is willing to offer remain enormous. The United States wants verifiable, permanent constraints on Iran's nuclear program. Iran wants sanctions relief and security guarantees that the U.S. will not launch another Operation Epic Fury the moment Iran's defenses are weakened by compliance. The United States wants Iran to dismantle its ballistic missile program. Iran views those missiles as the only credible deterrent it has against vastly superior U.S. and Israeli conventional military forces. The United States wants Iran to end support for Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other regional proxy forces. Iran views those relationships as essential to its regional influence and its ability to impose costs on U.S. and Israeli actions. Neither side is willing to make the concessions the other side is demanding, which means the diplomatic track is stalled. And while it is stalled, the fighting continues at a lower level than it did in February and March, but it continues. Israel is conducting operations in Lebanon. 24 people were killed yesterday in Israeli strikes. Hezbollah is launching rockets and drones at Israeli forces. The United States is running Project Freedom, the operation to escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which involves American forces sinking Iranian boats. Iran is pausing commercial traffic through the strait in response to what it calls ongoing violations. All of this is happening after May 5th, after the official end of Operation Epic Fury. So the war ended, but the war did not end. And the reason nobody is talking about that contradiction is because talking about it would require answering very uncomfortable questions about what the war was for, what it cost, and what it accomplished. Let me give you the numbers, because numbers do not lie, even when governments do. Operation Epic Fury, according to estimates from defense analysts, cost the United States approximately $85 billion in direct military expenditures. That does not include the economic costs of disrupted trade, higher oil prices, or the longer-term costs of replacing depleted munitions stockpiles. Just the direct cost of conducting the operation, $85 billion. For that cost, the United States and Israel killed over 3,400 Iranians, destroyed significant portions of Iran's military infrastructure, and demonstrated that U.S. and Israeli forces can operate inside Iranian airspace and strike targets throughout the country. Those are real achievements in a narrow tactical sense. But the strategic objectives, the reasons the operation was launched, were not achieved. Iran's government did not fall. Iran's nuclear program was not eliminated. Iran's ballistic missile capability was not destroyed. And the fundamental strategic competition that produced the conflict is still unresolved. So the United States spent $85 billion to win battles, but not the war. And now the government is hoping that if they just stop talking about it, the public will forget that the war happened at all. That calculation, the decision to quietly end the operation without declaring victory or admitting failure, tells you everything about how the people running this operation assess what actually happened. If they thought they won, they would be holding parades. If they were willing to admit they lost, they would be conducting reviews and accountability processes. The fact that they are doing neither means they know the result does not fit either category cleanly, and they would prefer not to discuss it at all. Now let me tell you what happens next, because the end of Operation Epic Fury does not mean the end of the crisis. It means the beginning of a new phase where all the same tensions exist, but the tools for managing them are weaker. The ceasefire is fragile. It has been violated repeatedly. The diplomatic negotiations are stalled. The economic pressure from the Strait of Hormuz closure continues, and every day that passes without a permanent settlement is a day that increases the risk of another escalation. Iran is under enormous pressure economically. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz hurts Iran as much as it hurts the global economy. Iranian oil cannot get to market. Imports cannot get through. The domestic situation is deteriorating, but Iran cannot reopen the strait without getting something in return, because reopening it without concessions would look like capitulation. Israel is facing its own pressures. The operational tempo in Lebanon is unsustainable. Israeli society is exhausted. Netanyahu needs to show results, either a clear victory or a negotiated settlement that he can sell as success. What he cannot sustain indefinitely is the current situation where fighting continues without resolution. The United States is caught between wanting to support Israel, wanting to avoid another full-scale war with Iran, and wanting to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to stabilize global energy markets. Trump wants to claim credit for ending the conflict, but he cannot claim credit for ending something that demonstrably has not ended. So the administration is stuck in the worst possible position, unable to declare victory, unwilling to admit failure, and hoping that the media moves on to other stories before anyone asks hard questions about what was accomplished. That hope, the hope that the public will just forget, is why nobody told you the war ended. Because if they announced it ended, someone might ask what was achieved. And the honest answer to that question does not support the narrative that this was a necessary and successful military operation. If you have stayed with me through this entire analysis, you understand something that most people scrolling past headlines do not. You understand that Operation Epic Fury ended not because the objectives were achieved, but because the operation became too costly to sustain. You understand that the fighting continues even though the official operation concluded. And you understand that the silence around the operation's conclusion is not an oversight. It is a deliberate choice to avoid accountability for a war that did not accomplish what it promised. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because this story is not over. The ceasefire is holding by a thread. The diplomatic negotiations are going nowhere. The risks of another escalation are real. And the gap between what the government is telling you and what is actually happening on the ground is as wide as it has ever been. The war just ended, and nobody noticed because they did not want you to notice. Pay attention anyway. Subscribe, share, because understanding what actually happened is the only way to hold anyone accountable for what comes next.